Well, welcome everyone to this iteration of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition presentation on defensible space and landscaping for defensible space. And we have a great lineup of speakers tonight. And my name is Jennifer Roberts, and I am a UC Master Gardener and work with the UC Cooperative Extension. And I would like to introduce to you all Roberta McIntyre from FireSafe Sonoma, who is going to kick things off for us. All right, Roberta.
Great, thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. So, hi everyone. I'm Roberta McIntyre, President and CEO of FireSafe Sonoma. FireSafe Sonoma is the countywide FireSafe Council, and our motto is evolving to caring for the environment and caring for community. So that's kind of what I'm hoping the board will go to. We've been around for over 25 years now, working in the wildland fire safety space. And yeah, we've recently, probably the last couple of years, we partnered up with Sonoma Ecology Center, Habitat Corridor, the Master Gardener program, to create what we're calling the Resilient Landscape Coalition. And one of the goals of that group is to provide education and outreach specific to fire resilient landscaping, but geared towards the specific geography of where you're living. These very smart folks, a lot smarter than me, use me, I think, as their guinea pig to figure out how to deliver this material. I come from the fire service where it was pretty much just limb everything up and take everything away. But they taught me that you can really have a resilient landscape in fire-prone areas. And I've learned how to do that, I think. And these folks are the experts. So they're going to present to you all some material specific to your geography with regard to resilient landscaping for fire safety. And with us today is Mimi Enright from Master Gardener. And Jennifer Roberts is in the background. She's our producer, if you will, running the show mostly behind the scenes. Also with us from the coalition is April Owens from Habitat Corridor and John Cagney from the Sonoma Ecology Center. So with that, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to hand it over to you all to provide us with this awesome information.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Roberta. I will go first. John Carnegie, just give me a second here to get my screen shared and move things around a bit. So thanks so much, Roberta. Again, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. This workshop, Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone, is funded by a County of Sonoma Vegetation Management grant. And we also thank Supervisor Gore's office for their support in bringing this workshop to you this evening. Again, I'm John Carnegie. I'm a Design and Implementation Project Manager with the Sonoma Ecology Center. This workshop was created specifically for the Healdsburg community, although there may be some other folks as well, as it was open to the wider community as well. So at the Sonoma Ecology Center, where I come from, our mission is to work with our community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in Sonoma. I'm very pleased to be the first of 3 panelists on the subject of firewise and sustainable landscaping. And before we dig in, I'll direct your attention to the subtitle here, Garden as if Life Depends on It. This is a quote from a professor of entomology named Doug Tallamy. He's written a number of books for the popular press, including one called Bringing Nature Home, that this comes from. And he's referring to the importance of supporting habitat in our home landscapes because our own lives are so inextricably connected to the natural world around us. So a couple of housekeeping notes. This is a webinar format, so a little different than some other Zoom formats. You do not have audio or video activated, and this webinar is being recorded. So, and we'll share within a few days the link to be able to see this on YouTube if you'd like to visit it again or miss something or would like to share it, please, with others that weren't able to join us. Also questions, you'll see if you hover down at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A box, and please put your questions there. We'd love to see your questions, but it'll be much easier for us if they go there rather than in chat, and we'll use chat as a way of giving you some additional information, but please put your questions in the Q&A box. And so you're going to find that we have, we're going to talk about defensible space and fire safety for sure, but we also have a strong preference for growing our landscapes with native plants due to their adaptability to the California climate and how they can provide so much habitat. So I've got a few things pictured here from my own home garden: coyote mint in the foreground, a couple of species of buckwheats, one here in the middle that's not yet in bloom, but will have a pink flower, and then this bright yellow sulfur buckwheat in the background is looking really good too. Okay, we'll dig in. Roberta already gave a bit of an introduction. The Resilient Landscapes Coalition is this partnership formed a few years ago to provide education and resources to help homeowners with their defensible space. From Fire Safe Sonoma, we've got Roberta McIntyre and Marika Ramston working with the coalition. Habitat Corridor Project features April Owens, who will be one of our speakers. Again, I'm from the Sonoma Ecology Center, not with us this evening, but a very active and founding member is Ellie Inslee that I work with there at the Sonoma Ecology Center. And then Mimi Enright and Jennifer Roberts are from the UC Master Gardener Program, and Mimi will be presenting next after me. It's also been an honor and extremely valuable to work with members of the fire agencies. We vet our content through their lens, and the whole time we're learning from them, and hopefully they're perhaps learning a bit from us as well. More information can be found on our website, which is sonomaresilientlandscapes.com. And I don't know why it just switched to the very last of the slides. So let me get back. Okay, so an outline for the workshop tonight looks like this. I'll start with a bit of context around fire and fire ecology and history, and then also get into ecology and sustainability. It's kind of setting the stage. And then next, Mimi will talk about defensible space design and maintenance principles, and then she'll turn it over to April, who will have many examples of landscape design, planting with California native plants in particular. We've got plenty of time for questions and some conversation after those presentations. So here we see a lovely scene of a native herbaceous perennial called coral bells, or heuchera, or alum root sometimes, growing in the shade of a live oak canopy and providing nectar and shelter for insects and birds and other wildlife. And it's an example of the kind of landscape that we'd like to help you create. So we're talking about landscapes that have multiple benefits, fire safety for sure, but also beauty and wildlife habitat. We sometimes talk about recovery of a forest after a wildfire, as if fire is always like a bad thing that you have to heal from. And the Sonoma Ecology Center has led many fire recovery walks. It's good to remember, though, that even though we use that word, fire is a natural and a healthy part of many of our ecosystems in California. The loss of a home, though, or of loved ones is not healthy, not natural, and understandably very traumatic. And some folks have responded to their concerns by clearing most of the vegetation around their homes. And that can result in problems of erosion, soil erosion, the growth of weeds that will become a fire problem in their own right, and certainly the loss of wildlife habitat. So they might create a moonscape of just gravel and rocks and maybe a few succulents. And there's others who are unsure what to do, and so they haven't done anything yet. So this workshop is all about creating defensible space that is beautiful, sustainable, and biodiverse. So here's a few scenes from the Healdsburg area taken after a fire a few years ago. To remind us of the kind of situation that we live in. And many of us choose to live here because of its beauty. And we understand that the land is adapted to fire. The watersheds in the Healdsburg area are made up of grasslands, of oak woodlands, mixed conifer forests, and some other vegetation types, which were tended by native people using fire as a tool to improve their hunting, acorn harvest, the stands of plants for food and for fiber. And these plant communities, in fact, much of the United States West, are fire adapted systems. But the combination of historic fire suppression, along with now climate change and warmer, drier, windier at times conditions, have brought us catastrophic wildfires. So while low intensity, frequent fire is part of a forest's natural cycle in this part of the country and part of a healthy forest ecosystem, these catastrophic wildfires that we've been having lately are costly, traumatic for unprepared landowners. And we have to combine defensible space around our homes with forest management that may utilize fire where it's appropriate, but also other management techniques where it isn't possible to use prescribed fire. The Healdsburg area has recently been the site of several prescribed burns, as you probably know, including the Fitch Mountain open space preserve, and familiarity with the practice and comfort, I guess, with the practice of prescribed burns is growing. Catastrophic wildfire does not only shift species diversity if it's intense enough, but also has huge environmental impacts. When structures burn due to the air and water pollution that's released from burning buildings, and the tremendous environmental costs of rebuilding, the costs of, or environmental costs and monetary costs of concrete, of lumber, of steel to rebuild. And so we want to avoid those as much as we can. A little bit of, just very briefly, some fire history. This map shows wildfires in this region between 1935 and 2014. And you see there is a patchwork of them. There's a few that are bigger, but many are these smaller fires of 2,000 to 10,000 acres. But if we look at just the fires during the years 2015 to 2020, we see fewer number, but very, very huge fires. We have the Kincaid fire, the Wallbridge glass fires, each of them in the sort of 55 to 75,000 acre range. So that's kind of been the trend of late. And then we also have the situation where we are moving into the wildlands more and more. So we're looking here at a map that shows urban density, high density housing development in red and low density housing development in yellow. The same map, but two different snapshots, 1964 and 2017. So the red areas are the areas of high density housing development. So this is the city of Santa Rosa here, or shown quite a bit larger on the 2017 map. This is the 101 corridor up to Healdsburg over here. And a little bit more perspective, Calistoga sits right here in St. Helena over in Napa County. The fires are shown here with this pink border. So in 1964, the Hanley fire had this kind of footprint. It moved from east to southwest. So coming from Napa County into Sonoma County. 2017 had a very similar actual footprint, especially as it entered Sonoma County from the east. But what's so different, as you see, that so much now of the fire footprint is in areas of housing development. So even though the fire was of similar size and intensity, weather conditions and fuel sources and so forth, the loss of life was much greater in the Tubbs fire, and the costs were much, much greater in the 2017 Tubbs fire because of our intrusion into the wildland. So we call this edge the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. And as we expand into the WUI, there will be more ignitions from our presence, more cars, more activity, expansion of the power grid, more loss of life and property, as we've seen comparing these two fires, a greater need to suppress wildland fires, and then the added problem that wildlife habitat is that much more fragmented, making it difficult for many plants and animal species to thrive. Some would say that we need to avoid building more in the WUI, but regardless, we've got what we've got at this point, and it's our responsibility to try to take care of the land, take care of each other, and take care of the wildlife that share this space with us. Let's have a quick look at risk and fire hazard severity, and then also mention some defensible space regulations that you should be aware of. So considerations of risk run from a sort of a broad regional level down to a very community and personal level, right down to your own property and your own home. This map starts with that broader, more regional landscape element. This is the CAL FIRE Fire Hazard Severity Zone map for Sonoma County. The colored parts of the map are the state responsibility area, sometimes called the SRA, and the white parts are mostly the local responsibility area, or LRA. I say mostly because there's a little bit of federal land around Lake Sonoma. But most of it is local responsibility area. And the three colors of the state responsibility area represent in red very high fire hazard severity zones, in orange high fire hazard severity, and in yellow the moderate fire hazard severity zone. So Healdsburg is here. If you're looking at this on a smaller screen, I'll point that out. Healdsburg is here, so surrounded mostly by moderate and high fire hazard severity, with a bit of the very high, mostly to the northeast. Now, Sonoma County is also working on updating their community wildfire protection plan. That's called a CWPP. And it, even though it's not yet quite complete, the update, but it has a lot of very good information about risk, and this kind of similar mapping to this is on their hub. And that's easy to find by just Googling Sonoma County CWPP. And that might help you with your own assessment of risk at this sort of broad regional level. Now, a little bit about regulations. There's a couple of state codes. One is this 4291. It refers to the SRA area. Another similar state code has pretty similar language and refers to other parts of the state that are not in the SRA. But it refers in both cases to sort of wildland settings, forest, shrub, grass-covered lands. It requires a 100-foot defensible space zone and has some language around an ember-resistant zone of 0 to 5 feet from structures. Now, becoming a little bit more local, there's a Sonoma County ordinance, Chapter 13A, that makes references to defensible space. The city of Healdsburg has its own regulations around this issue. Now, each person must assess their own personal risk, but that assessment should be well informed. So that's why we look at maps and things like that, look at vegetation types. You want to ask yourself, what are the vegetation patterns in the broader landscape around your community? How do they contribute to potential fields? Again, looking at that CAL FIRE map and the local CWPP mapping. What are the resources and conditions in my own neighborhood? Am I out in the country? More narrow roads, more difficult access, fewer ingress and egress routes? Or am I a little bit more in a residential neighborhood where there's lots of streets and a little bit more of an infrastructure around fire protection, fire hydrants, and so forth? Then you'd want to ask, what are the conditions on your own property, including the topography? Does the house sit at the top of a hill, which can be at greater risk? Is it down in a canyon where wind patterns may create greater risk? Has the house been assessed? Have home hardening practices been completed? This would be things around double pane windows, of materials of roof and siding, that sort of thing. And if so, then what steps can be or should be taken working out into the landscape? What is your own personal perspective on risk? How will I balance risk and other factors such as sustainability, aesthetics, the costs of doing home improvement, and modifications to the landscape? So you want to first start by understanding the requirements of state and local jurisdictions, but where there is some opportunity for interpretation, it's a matter of balancing priorities. Remember, though, that even though you're balancing your own priorities, your risk decisions intersect with those of your neighbors. If you choose not to do everything that you can, your house might put neighboring houses at risk. There are 3 types of fire exposure to structures during a wildfire event, and let's look at those. So first of all, radiant heat from a fire can cause ignition to the home. And this often happens from one burning house to another nearby, or in this case, an outbuilding. The heat created by that causes ignition of the structure. And then the countermeasure here is typically hardening of the home. Again, those things around windows and doors, siding and roofing, things of that nature. Direct flame contact can also occur when a wildfire burns right up to the edge of the property. And then the educational messages have often focused on this type of exposure and how to reduce direct contact by interrupting this continuous path of fire by changes in the landscape out here. But actually what happens the most is fire caused by embers. Embers are tiny bits of burning material that are blown from the forest fire front, and it may be a quarter of a mile or half a mile or a mile away or more. And these embers will rain down on the property, all over the property and on the roof and on the landscape. And so in a situation like that, sort of an ember storm, that can be the greatest cause of structure fires. They ignite building components and contacts directly, or they can ignite vegetation and other combustible items adjacent to or near the building, which can then result in a radiant heat or direct flame contact exposure. And embers have a way of finding the weaknesses in a home. They blow all over, get into all of the corners, will even go up into the vents and into the attic space, that kind of thing. Now, particular concern is the presence of dried leaves and other dry plant material that can accumulate on the roof and in the gutters, and also inside of landscape plants or that it's blown up against the foundation of the house. Since most building ignitions have been attributed to embers, this is a particularly important aspect to be aware of as we work to prepare our homes and landscapes against fires. So start looking at your home and landscape with a new lens for identifying any receptive fuel beds. Look at where an ember would ignite organic materials and transmit fire to your home. For example, embers may land on and ignite debris that is accumulated in the gutters. the burning debris then can cause direct flame contact with the edge of the roof. But embers, of course, will also fall on the landscape. And so you want to sort of imagine how that happens and think about what that path of fire might be. So I've plopped down a bit of fire started by embers here, and you can consider how the fire, if the fire will move and in what directions, and how, kind of considering the presence of dried plant material, the health or the status of shrubs and perennials and things that you have, flowers and so forth. What's going to happen if it moves up the hill and runs into this rock wall? Well, it may very well stop there. And so features like that can be very important. Will it get up into the trees because there's plants underneath, shrubs and so forth? Not so much in this photo, but that's the kind of thing you want to be thinking about and looking at. So in the next presentations, Mimi and April will discuss the guidelines for defensible space and for maintenance. And before I turn it over to them, I want to emphasize another element of the home landscape, and that's the importance of the ecological role that our gardens can play. So we have a great opportunity as we consider our home landscapes through the new lens here of fire resiliency to design our gardens so that they can play an important role in restoring the ecological system and encouraging sustainability. Our human development has destroyed and fragmented much of our wildlands. We tend to think of forests and grasslands and chaparral as the home for wildlife, but these wildlands are now so fragmented that our home gardens are needed to provide critical habitat. Doug Tallamy, the entomologist that I mentioned with the opening slide and the author of Bringing Nature Home, promotes the idea of making our gardens into habitat oases. He opens that book with the statement, for the first time in history, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. So our gardens can provide critical ecosystem services, and it can be at any scale. It's really just important to kind of jump into it. If it's a very small garden, let's just start with a plant or two, a native plant or two. It can even be a patio plant. If you're a renter or something, you can start at that level. And everybody working together will help contribute to this goal. So some of the ecosystem services that our gardens can provide are supporting biodiversity, enriching soil and holding it in place, cleaning and managing water, sequestering carbon, supporting pollinators, shading the home and the property, which provides some air conditioning, reduces our need for air conditioning and thus the carbon footprint of that sort of climate control. And I'll talk about a few of these in a bit more detail. I love this image here of all of the insects because so many animals rely on insects, either directly or indirectly for food. And without insects, in fact, there wouldn't be much other higher life. They are the thing that sort of connects plants to the rest of the world, to the vertebrates. We've been hearing a lot lately about the significant loss of insect biodiversity, as much as 75 or 80% over the last couple of decades. And the Western monarch butterfly is an important example of that. Studies have shown that loss of habitat is a primary driver, along with pesticide use and climate change. And it's important that we take some steps to protect and create habitat as we manage wildland fuels. Simply put, native plants like these shown here in the photo, and again, this is another one from my own garden, so I enjoy growing native plants very much. Native plants provide better habitat and resources for native insects, and our insects, again, are our primary food source for our birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, all up and down the food chain. So how do we support biodiversity? April's going to give you lots of examples of that. But here's a few general guidelines. We want to choose native plants most of the time. Again, California native plants are going to support our California wildlife. It is okay to have some number of non-native plants. Of course, our vegetables and many of our fruits are by and large not native plants, and we want to have those as well. And there can be some ornamentals as well. We have a certain rose or camellia that's a favorite. I love a lemon tree. I think it's one of the most important plants in a landscape, or most useful plants in a landscape. But if we can go towards 70 or 80%, a majority of native plants, that's going to help improve biodiversity by providing the food that wildlife needs: fruit, seeds, nectar, leaves, and support all of the insects that the next level of the food web depends upon, because these insects have evolved with plants over millennia. We also want to plant islands of plants, that is to say groupings or clusters of plants, as much as possible for bird and butterfly food. So we'll talk a little bit later about using islands in the landscape, but separating them for fire reasons, separating them with non-flammable materials. We also want to use integrated pest management, that is to say, use practices, whoops, sorry. Don't touch the mouse, is the rule here. All right, sorry, that's where we're at. Okay, that's where we're at. Use integrated pest management as much as possible to reduce pesticide use, and we'll want to provide a water source if possible. So insects specialize on specific plants and can't survive or reproduce without them in many cases. They're also generalists as well, but many are specific. So another way to support biodiversity is to take very good care of trees. Oak trees in particular. So oaks are a keystone species, meaning that they are so closely connected with so many other species, they provide so much food for other species that if they are removed from the ecosystem, the impacts are just tremendous. Here's a photo of an oak woodland with an understory of coral bells, which is a drought-tolerant native perennial and won't damage the root system. Oak trees are incredibly productive food factories for wildlife. We think first of acorns, but not only do they provide those, they also host huge numbers of insects and caterpillars that support many of our favorite garden birds, such as quail and bluebirds and robins and others, as well as lizards and other wildlife. So these insect species feed on the leaves, the twigs, bark, inside the wood of oaks, and where there are insects are also spiders, which are another important food source for wildlife. And then we do have the acorns, and they feed over 100 vertebrate species in California, many squirrels, deer, and many, many birds. So we want to keep all of our trees healthy, especially oaks, for the habitat they provide, but also because a declining tree can be very fire prone, and this would be true of shrubs and other plants as well. So it's important to protect the root system, including minimizing irrigation under oak trees, compaction, or digging within the drip line, or even beyond that if it's possible. And equally important, keep a couple of inches of leaf litter, kind of like you see in the photo, where it's appropriate. So not right up against the house, of course, but where it's possible to have some leaf litter on the ground. That feeds the soil microorganisms and supports the tree's health. Another way to enhance biodiversity is to prevent the invasion of exotic weedy plants. In the larger photo on the right, this area was cleared of vegetation, which exposed the bare soil to potential soil erosion and eliminates wildlife habitat. It's also asking for an invasion by invasive plants like this Scotch broom over here. These invasive plants reproduce very quickly. This is a very fire-prone plant. It is not at all very helpful for wildlife, and it displaces native plants where it grows. So you'll be hearing some recommendations in the other presentations for the spacing of plants and the spacing of plant groupings, and this may require some pruning or even plant removal. But the timing of this kind of vegetation management is very important. Birds are nesting from March through August, and the best time for extensive pruning and plant removal is going to be then from September to February. And let me touch on a few more defensible space ecosystem services here. Plants and landscapes enrich soil and hold it in place. Here are some native ground cover plants that are protecting the slope from soil erosion, which then protects water quality farther down in the watershed. Plants are also a defense against climate change as they sequester atmospheric carbon, and landscapes encourage stormwater to infiltrate on our own properties, protecting water quality and recharging our groundwater. I'll very quickly discuss a little bit carbon sequestration. So plants photosynthesize. They grow by drawing carbon dioxide from the air along with water and nutrients from the soil, and they do this to produce plant materials. They grow with cells that are carbon rich, and these cells are above ground and below ground. These plant parts are food then, of course, for all of the insects that I was talking about. So carbon is bound up in the plant itself, but as leaves fall, as roots grow and then die and grow, the carbon ends up in the soil. And soils are capable of holding tremendous amounts of carbon, more than the atmosphere can actually, and more than all of the above ground plant parts and animal life combined. So it's really a tremendous and underutilized resource. I come from an agricultural background before I got into landscape design and horticulture, and a sort of a movement in agriculture in this area especially is towards carbon farm plans. So farming practices that build carbon in soil. So it's often reduced tillage using cover crops, mulching, things like that. And it's very, very applicable as well to home landscapes. So carbon sequestration requires healthy plants and healthy soils with diverse active microbial communities. And speaking of these diverse and active microbial communities, soil is nurtured with organic matter such as leaf litter and compost. We can also avoid synthetic fertilizers and keep the soil covered with plants, with mulch, leaf litter, again, where those things are appropriate. And then finally, a bit about water, sorry. You want to do things to keep water on the property, especially given our current drought, but also recognizing that California, or most of California, has a very summer dry climate in every year. We can keep water on the property with landscape features like this one that was designed by April Owens, who will be speaking in a little while. These are features. A feature like this will collect stormwater, possibly from the roof and the gutters, or possibly just from the landscape itself. Hold it just for a few days as it percolates into the soil and contributes to the groundwater. This also keeps water from rushing out into the street and into the creeks, which has an element of pollution. It is just more water than the creek can really take at one time. We can also think about using gray water. So here's a laundry to landscape system, and these are sort of catching on. There's a lot of great resources around the use of gray water at Daily Acts, which is a Petaluma-based nonprofit. And then there are also ways of storing stormwater collected from roofs and gutters in tanks to use for irrigation later on. So I'll close with that, and I'll turn it over to Mimi Enright, Program Manager for UC Master Gardeners, who will talk about design and maintenance principles for defensible space. And with that, thank you so very much. And I look forward to your questions a little bit later on. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. All right, please bear with me while we do a little changeover on screen management. Are you guys seeing my slide set? Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Looks good.
You're good.
Thank you, guys. A little more manipulation here behind the screen. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to be here chatting with you tonight about resilient landscaping. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with who Master Gardeners are and what we do. We are trained agents of the University of California, and our mission is to extend the educational outreach of the university to our community. And we do that with a focus on sustainable landscape principles as our core message, all those great principles that John just stepped you through. And our goal as the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is really to marry those sustainable landscape principles with Firewise landscaping. John did such a great, eloquent job kind of setting up why that's important. Our climate is changing, and so are our landscapes. And we know that each property can and should be making a difference if they can. So I'm going to be sharing some basic information with you about defensible space and design and maintenance opportunities that you have to create a more firewise and sustainable landscape. And really, hopefully, giving you a framework for your assessing your landscape with a firewise lens. So the picture on this slide is in the hills above my home. I live about 5 minutes northeast of the town of Cloverdale in the old Preston Faith Healing community. There's some really cool history there. I live in, back to John's SRA and LRA map, I live in a very high fire severity zone, hazard zone, on a slope, directly abutting wildland interface. So that means my risk factor, as John discussed, is very high. So certainly I'm laser focused on the type of recommendations that we're sharing with you tonight, but each of us needs to assess, as John described, our own risk as we plan our actions to increase our safety during wildfire events. Okay, I have a lot of territory to cover in a very short amount of time. I'm going to start off by doing a quick touch on some basic principles, then discuss how to design your home landscape with fire in mind based on the different zones in the 0 to 100 foot zone around your home or structures on your property. A quick review of mulch and ongoing maintenance, which is one of the most important aspects of continuing to keep our properties as ready as we can before the next fire. So let's dive on in. So here's the bottom line. What you do to prepare your home and landscape for the next fire really matters. We know what the truths are in this slide. Your actions to prepare for the next wildfire really are key. And we all know how hard our firefighters have worked to protect our homes and communities. But given the scope of the wildfires we have seen, we know we can't assume that there will be a shiny red truck parked outside your home when fire may come. So attending this workshop is a really great first step, but we hope that you step away tonight with at least even a few action items that you can take forward in making your property better prepared for future fires. So all of our homes, family, community, and firefighters are perhaps a little more safe. Okay, John did a great job framing the 3 types of fire threat that we can experience during a wildfire event. I want to cover a few basics about fire and fuel, which are important foundations to the context of our conversation today. So very basically, fire must have 3 elements in order to burn, and that's fuel, oxygen, and heat. And which of those elements can we control? Well, the only element we can control is the fuel aspect. And fuel, very basically, is anything that will burn. And that certainly is anything that's organic matter, such as vegetation or landscape mulch. Certainly fencing, roofing, and decks, lawn furniture, or arbors, trellises, or planter boxes. So it's really about reassessing your landscape and looking at your potential fuel load to help you make some decisions about better preparedness in your defensible space zone. So here are our basic fire-wise landscaping principles. So resilient landscape design is really about plant selection and placement, your overall garden design with hardscape elements, and maintenance. And we hope that all this is done with that lens of sustainability that John framed so well about retaining water on your property, conserving water and energy, and supporting wildlife, as well as sequestering carbon. So I want to point out that there is not scientific research to support all of our recommendations, but I will point out through the presentation where recommendations are supported by scientific research. And as we go through today's presentation, any items you see highlighted in red represent Sonoma County code requirements. Okay, let's start with some key basic foundational recommendations to make your landscape more fire-wise. So on an ongoing basis, you want to make sure that you're removing all dead or dying plants and branches, and remove any ladder fuels. And I'll talk about ladder fuels in a little more detail in a few slides. As John referenced, you want to create, he talked about creating islands of planting from a biodiversity perspective, which is a really important aspect. But I'm going to talk about creating islands of planting with a fire lens with non-combustible paths in between them to break up or interrupt the flow of fire. We'll talk about that in some more detail. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to structures. We'll talk about the 0 to 5 foot zone and why that's so important. And you want to prune up any tree limbs at least 6 feet from the ground, or 1/3 of the height of the tree if it's a shorter tree, and maintain that on an ongoing basis. I was just pruning some tree limbs over the weekend that had creeped into our 6 foot zone. Okay, it's also important to consider alternatives to wood fences, such as concrete or rock walls or metal fences. Wire mesh fencing certainly can help reduce fuel mass while helping to preserve views. And gates made from organic material absolutely should not attach to the house, because that provides a direct flow for flames to move towards the house. And there's lots of scary pictures from firefighters of showing burned fences that transmitted fire directly to a structure and damaged or destroyed that structure. So really important consideration. So referenced ladder fuels a little bit earlier. Hopefully you're all familiar with that concept. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having fire move from that ground plane up into the crown of trees, and where that will then spread from crown to crown. So you want to avoid planting shrubs under trees. But if you do plant a shrub under a tree or a taller ground cover, you need to make sure you allow at least 3 times the height of that shrub between it and the lowest tree limb. Again, reminder about limbing up those trees to at least 6 feet in height from the ground, and continuing to maintain that as it grows. So how can you apply a Firewise lens to plant selection? Many of you may be hoping for a fire resistant plant list, but the reality is that all plants can burn. It's much more important to consider where you place a plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it on an ongoing basis. So we've started talking more about really considering your appetite for maintenance. And that's a really important selection criteria for plants as well. If you have a plant that you're going to need to be maintaining more regularly to keep it fire-wise, then, and you don't have the appetite to do that maintenance, then you might want to reconsider whether you want to select that plant and put it in your landscape. You also want to make sure you choose plants that will grow to a size that's appropriate for their location, so you're not having to constantly prune them back. When you pick up that little 4-inch pot with a plant at the nursery, you really need to pay attention to what its mature size will be and where you're planning to put it in your landscape. So you want to make sure you're locating plants where excess pruning isn't required to maintain that desired spacing you might have. Are you putting that plant somewhere where it will thrive? Is it a plant that prefers shade, but you're putting it in full sun? I made that mistake with the plant I put in my landscape earlier this year, and the plant is not happy with me, and I need to remove it. We all fall victim to that. What is your appetite for the ongoing maintenance? We talked about that earlier. Is the plant invasive? Will it spread to a neighbor's property and create more possible fire threat or exposure? And how might it change over its lifespan? And lavender is a really great example. It's kind of a ubiquitous wine country plant that a lot of people love to plant. It starts out as herbaceous or non-woody, and over its lifespan, which generally runs about 7 years, becomes much more woody over time. So I have to say, after being really deeply enmeshed in this topic, I've started to see a landscape through a different lens. And I think about how fire will move through the landscape around my home and how much fuel that might add to a fire and how much woody mass is there in my landscape. With that lens, last winter, for example, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really woody. And they grew back beautifully in the spring with much more herbaceous stems with less woody mass. I know they're going to become woody again in a year or two, and I'll cut them back again. But again, really important point. If you don't want to do that kind of regular maintenance, then plant selection for how a plant might change over time is a really important consideration as well. Here's some work that one of our Resilient Landscape Coalition partners, Ellie Inslee, did on her property out in Occidental to remove some ladder fuels, in this case, managing an older juniper shrub below a trait. And on the lower left, the picture shows cleanup work that Ellie did to the interior of the juniper shrub to clean out old dead branches and debris. And you can see how she's stepped it back in the picture on the right from the tree base. And she says it's deceptive from the picture. It really is at least 3 times the height of that shrub to the lowest tree limb. So that's a great example of the type of work, maintenance work that we all need to be doing on our properties. Okay, another important consideration, where shouldn't you plant? We're going to talk about this in some more detail, but you don't want to plant within 0 to 5 feet of your house or structures, under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, under or near decks, and in those inside corners of houses. John talked about ember cast, and embers can tend to accumulate in those inside corners. So you want to make sure you don't have anything in those inside corners that could ignite. Okay, so let's dive into the zones that make up the 0 to 100 foot defensible space around your home and structures. Your starting point is the house. And we're not going into the topic of home hardening as our focus is on the landscape. But there are many wonderful resources to help guide you through the home hardening process. But here are the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that we'll be discussing today. After you've hardened your home, you want to then move out to the 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your home and structures. We should actually show that 0 to 5 foot around that garage as well. Then you want to move out to the 5 to 30 foot zone, and then finally out to the 30 to 100 foot zone. So let's go into some more detail on these 3 defensible space zones. Okay, your first zone is zone 0, called the Ember Defense Zone. And this really is a relatively newer zone introduced into the defensible space recommendations. And I will say there is legislation that's coming from the state of California for those of us who live in the SRA that John discussed earlier, with requirements for implementing a zone 0. And I want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. And the objective of this zone is to reduce the chance of windblown embers from a fire landing near the home and igniting combustible debris or materials. This zone is closest to the house, so it requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. Classically, we have massed shrubs against the house called foundation shrubs. So this is really a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel, possible fuel this generates for fire in immediate proximity to our house or structures. Optimally, there should be no combustible or organic materials in this zone. So again, in my scenario, where I'm in a very high fire severity risk zone on a slope in a WUI, I have a full implementation of my 0 to 5 foot zone with no plantings or organic materials. At a minimum, you want to remove or minimize planting in any vulnerable places where fire could enter your home that we talked about just in the last 2 slides, about which are under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, and under or near decks. And again, no fences or wood gates attached to your home, as they can move fire directly to your home. And that would also apply to hedges. So you don't want a continuous hedge that goes into your zone 0 and could transmit fire into that zone. We talked about how incredibly important maintenance is. And in the Ember Defense Zone, in zone 0, from a maintenance perspective, you want to make sure that you're regularly removing dead plant materials, that same basic principle I shared earlier in the presentation. At a minimum, you want to make sure you're removing debris from this zone on a red flag warning day, or if you have time, which is probably not likely, before evacuating from a fire. You want to prune all tree limbs 10 feet from a chimney or a stovepipe outlet, and that is a county code requirement. So during a wildfire, as John talked about, thousands of embers can rain down on roofs and pelt the side of homes like hail during a storm. And if those embers become lodged in something easily ignited on or near the house, the home will be in jeopardy of burning. So the leaves pile up in the same places every year. And that's the biggest problem here, would be exposure to the vulnerable walls. I'm sorry, this is a different picture. You could have exposure to vulnerable wall sides of houses and not possibly the Class A roofing material. But embers coming into contact with flammable material is the major reason why homes are often destroyed in wildfire. This is a picture from eastern part of Sonoma County in a more redwood forest area, and you can see all the debris buildup on that roof. Hopefully that's a pretty clear depiction. That's a really important aspect to be maintaining, especially during fire season. So we aren't suggesting that you have to remove trees if they're in the 0 to 5 foot zone. Trees provide really important shade during the summer, which can reduce energy needs inside your home. The most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris that they drop, that you then need to maintain on your roof and in the zones immediately around the structures. And it can make your maintenance easier if you remove any limbs within like 6 to 10 feet of the roof. Certainly during a red flag warning day, if you have to evacuate from your house and you have time, you want to make sure you clean up any debris in this zone or enter structures on your roof. For example, I have an oak tree that's in my 5 to 30 foot zone that regularly year round is dropping twigs and acorns and leaves. So for sure on a red flag warning day, I'm out there cleaning up all that leaf debris from that 0 to 5 foot zone. And again, it is a county code requirement to cut any tree limbs within 10 feet of a stovepipe or chimney outlet. And you need to maintain that spacing year round. Okay, let's move on to zone 1, or the 5 to 30 foot zone, called the home defense zone. And this is likely where firefighters will make a stand if they are working to defend your home during a wildfire. So keep that in mind to ensure that they have ease of access for defending your home. So the recommendation for this zone is to plant in islands that are separated by pathways, optimally inorganic, especially if you're in a higher fire severity zone. The goal is to interrupt the flow of fire to your home. Plantings in this zone should optimally be herbaceous or not woody, and 3 feet in height or less. And you can consider inclusion of shrubs or shrub or trees, but optimally that would be a specimen or a single tree or shrub rather than masses in this zone. You want to make sure that all plants are accessible for regular maintenance, as you want to keep all plants clear of dead plant material. And of course, this is a really great zone for hardscapes such as patios. So the basics in zone 1 from a design lens are low growing, mostly perennial plants that are well maintained, and that includes well irrigated. And you want to consider inclusion of hardscape to break up the planting areas. This is a Santa Rosa home with a dry creek bed, which is a great use of hardscape for the 5 to 30 foot zone. In zone 2, the 30 to 100 foot zone, which is also called the reduced fuel zone, we really have the same basic principles as we do in the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. You want to continue that focus on creating islands of vegetation, ensure you have easy access for maintenance, and wider pathways can help facilitate that access, and continue your vigilance on ladder fuel removal and regularly removing all dead plant material. It is a county code requirement in Sonoma County that all annual grasses must be mowed to 4 inches in height during fire season. You don't want to cut them to ground because that could create erosion in the soil. And if you've moved any, if you want to move any wood piles to this zone with nothing combustible located near that pile. Okay, these are CAL FIRE recommendations based on their experience for plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your home. I want to stress that these are not mandated by law and they're not supported by scientific research. These guidelines for spacing are due to flame height and are based on the slope of the land around the home, which is a major consideration in assessing wildfire risk. I think we all know that a fire will certainly burn faster and more intensely uphill than along flat ground. So that steeper slope will result in a faster moving fire with longer flame lengths. So this graphic is depicting shrub spacing. In conversations with fire officials, they have advised us that they consider low growing, well irrigated grasses, ground covers, or perennials to be considered to be acceptable between these plant groupings. But again, each of us needs to assess the overall risk with degree of slope and fire risk to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. This graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing, as well as the vertical separation, that ladder fuel topic that we discussed earlier. Spacing on less than a 20% slope of 10 feet is recommended. And on steeper slopes, that recommended distance is increased. So we don't have to denude our landscapes in the 100-foot perimeter around the home, but we certainly want to make sure we have spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the house. Here's a great East Bay mud graphic that shows before and after maintenance for an existing mature landscape, illustrating some of these concepts that I've been talking about. In the before, we see no break-in planted areas and shrubs massed against the house. And after maintenance, we see islands of vegetation. The shrubs next to the house have been removed, trees have been limbed up, and ladder fuels removed, and shrubs and trees have been thinned. You certainly want to make sure that you, your family, and firefighters have clear access in and out of your property. Well, what would you do to make this driveway more firewise? Per those concept of what we've talked about, you would cut the grass to 4 inches in height during fire season, limb up those trees, follow those same vegetation management principles as zone 2. It is important to maintain vegetation on both sides of the driveway. Ideally, you want to have it 10 feet from the road edge and 15 feet vertically for access by fire vehicles. And you want to maintain 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for passage of vehicles. Okay, so once you've done the work to harden your home and prepare your defensible space, you want to make sure you reach out and work with your neighbors. Work together to develop a fuel reduction plan. Certainly watch for maintenance needed and consider what the total volume of vegetation is in the area and if there are any ladder fuels. If you reside in a more densely forested area, you can control fire behavior by reducing ladder fuels, opening up the canopy, and maintaining ground fuels. This will help the firefighters with fire suppression during a fire. This is actually in the 30 to 100 foot zone behind my house where I live. And this is work that our neighbors and have done to help develop this shaded fuel break from the threat of fire. But because new vegetation will regenerate in these areas, reentry into the stand is necessary every few years. Again, consider the context of where you live and the work that you need to do. And this is This is also, this is one of my neighbors. It doesn't come through very well in the picture, but this is also in my 30 to 100 foot zone, is my neighbor's property. And you can see he's got a pile of branches waiting for the Sonoma County Free Chipper Program to come chip them. Really important for all of us to be working in concert. It is an ongoing process, chipping away at all the work that needs to be done every year. And we're all making incremental improvements to make our homes and neighborhoods better prepared for future fires. So from a maintenance perspective throughout the year, again, you want to continuously monitor for this needed maintenance. It is a county code requirement to regularly remove dead plants and branches from trees and shrubs. And it's also recommended to remove vines from trees and shrubs so they don't transmit fire from the ground plane up into trees and shrubs. Here are maintenance recommendations annually before fire season. As John mentioned, you want to make sure you're doing any pruning and vegetation thinning in fall and early winter to avoid harm to bird breeding, generally from mid-February to the end of July or August. Again, don't cut grass to bare dirt. It's really important to keep viable vegetation in place for erosion control. Be particularly sensitive about dry leaf litter at the beginning of fire season. Yeah, I started paying attention in May. I think that's going to be our new drill. And of course, again, if you've moved a wood pile closer into the house during the winter, you want to make sure that you're moving that at least 30 feet out from buildings and optimally cover it with fire-resistant tarps and clear surrounding vegetation. Every few years is needed. You want to thin and reduce those tree canopies to remove twig growth, maintain that separation between trees and reduce overall fuel load. Keep the lowest branches of trees, again, pruned up, at least 6 feet from the ground. I think I've hit that topic quite enough. And again, cut back any ground covers and vines to remove buildup of dry stems and leaves, and cut back your shrubs and perennials to remove them. Okay, mulch. Mulch is a really important application of sustainable landscape principles. It helps us with weed suppression and also water conservation. But wood mulches are organic and as such combustible materials which can transmit fire. It's recommended not to use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. Again, there's scientifically supported research for no organic mulch in the Ember Defense Zone, that 0 to 5 foot zone. Composted wood chips demonstrated the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments tested in a study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. They are redoing that study. I'm excited and hopeful for some new results of that study in the next year. The recommendation is to use 2 to 3 inches of mulch in islands of planting. And again, in those higher fire risk areas, you might want to consider separating those mulched areas with non-combustible or ignition resistant materials such as concrete, gravel, or rock. You could use native grass lawn in your 5 to 100 foot zone. And this gives you some other great examples for separating those mulched areas. Again, the recommendation is to choose larger sized wood mulch. The picture on the left shows composted wood chips. Absolutely no gorilla hair. On the right, that's gorilla hair mulch. It's a picture from Fire Safe Marin. And you can see how embers landed in the gorilla hair and can tend to smolder. And the risk is that firefighters, if they've come to your house to defend it, may move on to defend another property, and those embers could flare up and then spread fire to the house from that gorilla hair. Okay, so here's a quick recap on the Firewise design considerations in the defensible space zone. In the 0 to 5 foot zone from the house, no organic materials if possible. Use inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones. In the 5 to 30 foot zone from the house, you want to plant in islands with materials such as low herbaceous perennials, grasses, succulents, with individual or specimen shrubs or trees. And then in the 30 to 100 foot zone from the house, same basic principles as 5 to 30, but you can include some shrub or tree groupings in widely spaced groups separated by areas that break up the flow of wildfire. Ongoing maintenance is essential for a Firewise landscape, particularly with the drought. You'll want to be monitoring trees and shrubs closely and removing any dead or dying branches. Prune out any dead material that can build up in the interior of shrubs if possible. It's highly flammable. And if you are prioritizing removal of any plants due to the drought, You certainly might want to prioritize removal of any shrubs under trees to remove any possible ladder fuels. And hopefully, I know it's a quick fly through the content. This gives you a better framework for assessing your landscape and making it more fire-wise. We have lots more information and resources on our Master Gardener website. And here's a link to our webpage, which hopefully Jen can put in the chat. And you are always welcome to send your questions to our Master Gardener information desk via the email listed. And that is it from me. And I'm going to turn it over. Hopefully I'm not too off time. I'm going to turn it over to April Owens from Habitat Corp Project.
Thank you, Mimi. So I'm just going to be backing up Mimi's wonderful content with some beautiful photos. Yay. So hello, everybody. I see like at least 30 people out there. It's exciting to see you all coming to our Resilient Landscape Coalition presentation. So I'm April Owens, and I'm going to like fill in some photographs and a lot of practical information around this work we're doing. So I'm the executive director of the Habitat Corridor Project. And we started as a demonstration garden based organization, and we've shifted to more education and design, I guess. So I just want to talk a little bit about our background. So I'm a landscape architect and designer, and I created the Habitat Corridor Project with Nancy Bauer, a restoration ecologist. And we've really dialed down our design aesthetics so my design aesthetic, I guess I'll start there. So we honor the sense of place and plant community to the site. We keep water on site. We think about where landscape materials come from. And we use at least 80% of California native plus 20% of like your favorite like low water use plants. So resilient landscapes consider drought, fire, development, and biodiversity as they're designed. So as John and Mimi were talking about, like we've really digested that it's not just about fire, it's not just about saving water, it's really about creating this whole ecosystem in your garden. And in Healdsburg, you all have, I know a lot of you people are here from other places, but the plant communities that we are considering up in Healdsburg area are Oakwood Land, mixed evergreen forest, chaparral, grassland, and a lot of riparian. The Healdsburg, the river runs through your space. So when we look at design, I'm kind of here to help you think about design in your landscape. So sustainability and design. So it really takes you backing up in your landscape and thinking about where the water is coming in on your landscape. Are you in a small resident, like urban garden, or are you more in a native space, like out in a different ecosystem? So I want to make sure that you all feel like we are addressing the small urban garden as well. Although a lot of our gardens, my gardens that I create with the Habitat Corridor projects are broader landscapes, you can address this in your smaller landscape, your smaller urban landscape. So I usually back up on why use California native plants, but I wanted to start with why use California native plants. So I am the one that like wants to push you to think about why we would use plants from our region. And my reasons are biodiversity and the food web. So they're sustainable, resilient, they're adapted to our local region, so they are easily hydrated, and they're beautiful, and they also support the great biodiversity of food web. So I know we've given you a lot of information today, so I thought we could just take a moment, and you could put in your chat, in the chat, if you use native plants, if you're like interested, or what your gardens are like. and just sit up and take a jiggle and go to the restroom or whatever, just to take a break. For like, let's give it 5 minutes. I'm excited to see what you guys add to the chat. Of course, I can't see the chat, Jen. I don't know where it is, but I will find it. Here we go. So Jen, if anybody is adding anything to the chat, let me know.
Will do. Nothing so far.
Okay. Or where you're located, like who's here. It'd be great to hear what's going on with all you. I'm just going to give it like another 2 minutes. So everybody's really quiet, so that's fine. We'll just move on. So I'm going to highlight what Mimi and John talked about with our work at the Habitat Corridor Project, and I own a private landscape design firm. So design in the 0 to 5 is really about keeping those ignitable materials out and seeing it as an opportunity. So you have an opportunity to have decorative rock and boulders, permeable hardscape, fountains for bees, birds, butterflies, or shallow boulder. It's important for habitat, and we'll talk about that more, to have water in the landscape. Containers, we've just been doing some deep dive into some research with different organizations, but it's really important to think about your containers. We don't want wood containers or any kind of combustible materials in the 0 to 5. There's also the opportunity in the 0 to 5 to use some really interesting components. Like a lot of times I'll use decorative rock, and then some interesting steel edging, and then turf that is native. So it uses a lot less water. And that comes from Delta bluegrass. But you are investing some water into that space. In the 0 to 5 is also wonderful to have like some wonderful hardscape elements, and then also adding in out of the 5 some beautiful California native plants like this Verbena de la Mina that I didn't use before I met Mimi, and now I've been enjoying its loveliness. This is a side yard in a residential home in Santa Rosa. So it's a little messy, but we put down flagstone and some 1.5 inch Trinity cobble. Another wonderful aspect to embracing your 0 to 5 or your 0 to maybe 10 is having a patio space in that space. I know Mimi showed the same garden, but you can use containers and seating elements in that space, and maybe a little fountain. Just make sure on the red flag days that you take up your cushions and make sure that anything flammable is out of that space. Another beautiful use of the 0 to 5 to 10 is creating, this is in Albuquerque, New Mexico, using a beautiful art element with crushed rock. So, and then you could have that be as a wonderful courtyard. In this image, in the 0 to 5 to 10, recreating a seating area would be we saw cut this existing concrete and relaid it with cobble. So it's permeable and reused. This image of the 0 to 5, I would like, this is a really good maintenance issue. I would make sure that from June to September, you move your barbecue and your tables out of this space. This is 0 to 5 up in the Mark West area with outdoor shower and some nice Trinity cobble. Another element in the 0 to 5 could be some flagstone with low growing. This is Diamondio. It's a not native ground cover, but with a very well maintained, very well hydrated ground cover. Another 0 to 5 issue we talk about a lot with the Resilient Landscape Coalition is old growth trees. So this is an image very far back, like at least 700 feet from a home that survived the Kincaid fire, and they had invested in their trees. So if you want to keep your old growth trees over your home, so there's a home under those 3 beautiful oaks, and before the Kincaid fire, they had spent a lot of time grooming, hydrating, and cleaning up their trees over 20 feet, not just 10 feet, which is the requirement. So their home survived and the fire whipped through around, but they had spent a substantial amount of time maintaining those trees to make sure their home was safe. So we encourage you to keep your trees over your home and in the wildlands, but make sure that you're hyper vigilant on making sure that they are maintained. So in the 5 to 30 is where we have a little bit of we're letting go a little bit, but it's still an important zone to only use well hydrated and maintained plants, mass plants and islands with space between them. As Mimi talked about, we've just got newly fresh off the press information that 75 square foot or so is a typical island. So we talk about 5 to 30 as using islands of plants that are well maintained, well hydrated, and low growing. I use mounds a lot in these landscapes. These are also opportunities for swales and rain and water gardens, which we'll look at now. So here's some fun ideas in your 5 to 30 and 0 to 5. So this one is using Lipia, which is a native ground cover. And then thinking about 5 to 30, you have some parking areas, you have some strips of fun hardscape. So you can have a little fun in your landscape. You don't have to be so serious. Out the front door, they have some pavers. So think about all the ways that you can create fire safety. You also have paths as separation of islands. So these are flagstone and flagstone pavers and California fescue masses, and then the islands of habitat beyond. But you can also use really inexpensive materials like drain rock. We've used drain rock in a lot of pathways out in this zone with fieldstone walls. So think of walls as also the break in your landscape, as Mimi was telling you, these 4-foot spaces. So some fun plants. So I'm going to dapple in the plants. I get to talk about plants a little bit. So this is ground cover buckwheat, Eriogonum Warner Little. So there's a lot of really wonderful habitat plants that you can add into your landscape. Buckwheats, again, are a wonderful habitat plant that bumblebees, butterflies, everybody loves. So, and there are ground covers to large shrubs. So you can really, if you go to the nursery and learn more about these different plants, there's a lot to enjoy. So in this zone, you're massing well-maintained plants. So in the 5 to 30, you're trying to mass these well-maintained plants with some non-combustible spaces in between them. So those are with crushed rock, pathways. There's all kinds of ways to keep these islands separated. Another plant that's wonderful to dapple into this zone is salvias. They're a larger species with many different cultivars. And what I've found is they like to be cut back even annually. So you can cut them down to the ground and let them come back, and they're much more vibrant and well hydrated. We don't talk about fire resistant species, as Mimi said, but like with maintenance, you can have a more hydrated plant in your landscape that's super biodiverse, attracting. Sonoma sage is a ground cover version of salvia. It's just lovely. So water in the garden, a rain garden and swales. Swales are just an easy low place in the garden to catch water. So even if you have a small garden, a large garden, you can create a low space in your garden to, when the rain finally comes, to just sink it in. We also make them more vibrant, or I don't know what you'd say, but like you can have like with more cobble and with grasses, and you can use swales as a space to create those breaks between the islands of plants as well. So it's a fire safer space in your garden. So plant hydration. This is something we've shifted a lot around. We used to call it irrigation, but the key in your fire-wise resilient garden is to make sure your plants are well hydrated. And you also want to create soil health. So you want to make sure that the soil is hydrated as well. So little irrigation emitters to each plant, just hydrating the little soil structure around that plant, is not as adapted and healthy for the plant as thinking about either irrigating the whole system once a month, so you have some nice drip or some sprinklers that are low water use, like Hunter MP rotators, or drip on a grid, so you run the emitters through the landscape so that the soil around all the plants are hydrated. It ends up taking a little bit more maintenance, but the plant health and the health of the soil is much more important. I also encourage folks to, in the dry season, we don't have fire seasons anymore because it happens all year round, but in the dry season, July, August, September, October, I encourage you to get out in your garden and put a sprinkler out or hand irrigate, get to know your plants, make sure your irrigation system's working. It's important to see what's going on versus just turning on an irrigation system and leaving it, because every plant is different and needs different kinds of hydration. I know that's a lot so far. I'm just going to check the chat for a second. I can't see it. So, so we've been out to the 0 to 5, 5 to 30. So if you are actually, like, most people just have that space. You have the, 0 to 30. If you have a larger landscape and you have a 30 to 100, this is the opportunity that you can, in the 5 to 30, you can have a few shrubs and such, but in the 30 to 100 is beyond kind of the major defensible space. And this is a space where you can have larger islands of plants with more habitat and more shrubs. So maybe in the 5 to 30, you have 1 shrub per island. In this zone, 30 to 100, you can have maybe 2 or 3 or 5 to create that overstory that birds and native pollinators need. So I'm just going to talk through a few shrubs that I love, and we can talk about it more in the question and answer period. But we have toyon. So these are plants that work all over California, but especially in those hotter zones up there where you guys are in Healdsburg. So toyon, flannel bush, California lilac. You can have these wonderful groupings of plants that can tolerate really severe maintenance. Another California native shrub that I love is coffeeberry, Frangula californica. Mount San Bruno cultivar is one that I use a lot. It's like 4 feet by 5 feet tall, can tolerate a lot of different zones and irrigation levels. This image is their coffee berries on. So they have these coffee berries, but when they bloom in the spring, they're just covered with biodiversity. It's pretty incredible. In this picture, there's a coyote brush and some manzanita in the background. So there's a lot you can resource. Manzanita species are another adaptable, highly maintainable species that we can use in this area, especially up northern Sonoma County. People think that people are scared of coyote brush and manzanita, but they take really good hard pruning and are really adaptable. And in the winter, especially manzanita, provide hummingbirds with an amazing food source with their January bloom period. In the 30 to 100, I just wanted to talk for a second about shaded fuel breaks. So this is a site that we worked on up in Bennett Ridge in more middle Sonoma County, but it definitely is a great example for northern Sonoma County where all these like wonderful oaks. So this site was burned through in the 2017 fires. The house survived, but the trees were burnt under. All the oaks survived. So we've been encouraging the oaks to survive and keeping the ground level weed whacked so that it's a shaded fuel break for future fires. But in this zone, this looks like you can't have anything on the ground level, but you can have some hedgerows and some shrubs underneath. But this is just a lovely example of shaded fuel break.
5 minutes, April.
Thank you. So I just have a few tips for successful habitat planting. That's like my groove and habitat corridor project. So you want many types of flowers and you want large groupings, like we call them pollinator targets. So if you fall in love with one plant like this salvia, the hummingbird sage, you want like 5 of them. If you fall in love with a native salvia, you want 5 of them. So just make sure you get like large grouping of plants. Just don't just get one. You want plants that flower at different times and then plants that provide both nectar and pollen sources. So I encourage you to learn more. Reach out to me at habitatcorridorproject.org. You can also check out calscape.org and you can plug in where your garden is, and it'll give you all the plants. And if you're in the shade and the sun, it's a lovely resource. So I didn't get a ton of why. I'm sorry, I kind of missed that chat moment, but this is my son when he was 3 and now he's 15. So back to why. I thank you for participating, but also like we need to leave our gardens for the next generation. So even these small patches, this is at Casa Grande High School, like this small patch grew in over the last 10 years, and there are an amazing amount of pollinators and plants and manzanita that can really support communities. So even small patches are important in the landscape. So I wanted to tell you, Jen will tell you too, that thank you for coming. We will send out an email with a video recording and PowerPoint slides and a post-workshop survey to help us improve. And this is just more about like, please head over to our website. We're changing it over, and we're coming up with a much more like wonderful website. But for now, it's what it is. And please join us on our website. That's all I got.
All right. Thank you, April.
You're welcome.
All right. And
I
thank you.
actually came on time today. I don't know.
Great.
Crazy.
All right. So we do have a few questions in the
Great.
Q&A box. And also, I do want to tell you, April, people did respond in the chat. So
Great. I'm sorry I couldn't see it.
Yeah, it's all
It's my
good.
technological difficulties.
We have someone from north of Healdsburg, someone from Grayton,
Yay.
someone in El Dorado County, and someone else from Healdsburg in the Fitch Mountain neighborhood. So we have some great questions about plants and maintenance. So first, how would you define woody areas in otherwise healthy plants? Should they be pruned out if possible?
Shall I start, and then John and April can weigh in, and Roberta, if she wants to weigh in on some plant questions. So, I think kind of the classic example of what can create challenges and create something in a woody plant that's more fire prone is when folks, there's so much shearing and boxing and rounding of often of evergreen shrubs, and that can create dead buildup of twigs and leaves on the interior of the plant. So that's a great example of what not to do to your woody plants, but it is a very common practice in landscape maintenance. I guess in terms of in an otherwise healthy plant, a great example is, for example, manzanita, which is a really lovely native. I've got some beautiful specimens in my garden, but they can tend over time with age to build up dead twig buildup, along the base of the limbs as it matures. And it's really easy just to go in and snap those off. So I don't know, in terms of, it's kind of a tough question, but I would also think about if you've got a denser shrub and you're keeping it in closer proximity to your structures, maybe think about thinning it out so it's not as much woody mass based on where it is placed in your landscape and what your fire risk is. I guess that's the most I can think of around that topic.
I think a lot of natives, like I've learned, and I literally only in the last like 5 years of actually installing gardens, is that they really like are adapted to fire, and so they really like to be cut back hard. So you can really like cut back ceanothus, you can cut back manzanita, toyon. After the fires in 2017, toyon has come back beautifully. So they're pretty forgiving. They don't have to be scared of cutting things back.
Yeah, when I think of woody areas in otherwise healthy plants, the ugliest example that comes to my mind is the interior of a juniper, where it's really dry and wood inside. It looks really nice on the outside, but if an ember gets in there, it's going to be disastrous. And another example that I have from personal experience is I've got several oak trees on my property, and because of poor pruning earlier, some of the branches have gone dead. They're literally attached to the tree, but they're dead and dry. So over time, I've been cutting those out, thinning up the oak tree, and it actually seems to be doing a lot better now than it has in years past. So I'm not sure if that helps answer the question or not, but that's what comes to mind from my brain.
Great. Okay, another question about plants. What are some non-flammable succulents which are also freeze resistant?
So shall I start again?
Go, Mimi.
Okay. There are some plant characteristics that that make a plant maybe a little less prone to fire, but they aren't non-flammable. Everything will burn. But succulents certainly have more water mass that they retain in their foliage. There are some great native succulents. I don't know off the top of my head which all are freeze resistant. You got to check the can. You have to know your own, how cold it normally gets in your home, in your community, in your neighborhood. So I don't keep a reference point in my head of which are freeze resistant. There are some that are more freeze prone, like aeoniums, which are really striking. But you can also provide a little protection from frost by, other plant cover. So there's strategies you can adopt with helping succulents be more adaptive in colder weather. I personally really love Sedum spatulifolium. I can put it in the chat so you don't have to try to work out the name. It's a wonderful native sedum ground cover. There's just so many aloes. I'm a big aloe geek. I really love aloes. There's some that are a little more freeze sensitive, but I take the risk because I love the aloes so much. I will say we are developing a succulent page on the UC Master Gardener website. We've got a succulent expert who's developing a page of recommendations on succulents in Sonoma County. So watch our website. Subscribe to our monthly email blast, and we can share that with you when that new website comes out. But John or April, any more you'd add on succulent question?
I can add a little. So I like succulents. Northern California is not super rich in native succulents, but there are some. The sedum that Mimi mentioned is one of them, and there are a couple of species of Dudleas that like the coast. One is bluff lettuce, and I'm looking over here because I looked up the name. It's Dudlea farinosa. I have that, and I have maybe 3 other Dudlea species that I think come from Southern California, but have survived well in my Napa garden. It might be a little bit more mild than Healdsburg, for example, if that's where the question's coming from. But they've tolerated temperatures probably down to the 26 to 28 degree range, and have done all right. So a couple other things I think of that I have had are a kind of yucca called Hespero yucca whipple eye. Our Lord's candle, I think, is a common name for it. A pretty big yucca with wicked sharp spines on the ends, and eventually it bloomed, which was pretty dramatic, and then it slowly declined over about the next 3 years. And just this spring, I finally removed it with some considerable effort just to get to it because of those spines. But that one was interesting, a real dramatic plant. Another one that adds a little bit of drama, but not quite so much, and it's much easier to kind of live around, is Hesperaloe parviflora. This is also not a native of California truly, but close in that it's from Texas, New Mexico, and I think into Arizona somewhat, but it's certainly hardy in my Napa garden, and I like it because it is very attractive to hummingbirds. And I'll throw out one more. I see that it's kind of considered a succulent. Louisia are these little perennial sort of succulent plants with charming little flowers. Often Calflora, the nursery in Windsor, has some of them. Really more of a rock garden plant, very diminutive. It's not going to fill up a space, but it's pretty charming, or could be, nice in a little patio potted plant arrangement. So there's a few ideas, and I can put some of these names in chat.
And I've got a way, and I love the Hesperaloe parviflora. I've got some in my garden in Cloverdale. Sorry, I used to live in Healdsburg, now in Cloverdale, and they're thriving. One's blooming right now, beautiful blooms, like a pale peachy pink, and the hummers are just all over it. It's wonderful. April, any succulent thoughts?
Oh, I love succulents. So that's one of the places that I allow non-natives. Crazy talk, but there's so many like non-native succulents that are fun Mediterranean plants that people can use in their landscape. So, because like some of the beautiful chalk Dudleas and a lot of the succulents from California just do not tolerate inland heat. And so, you need to shade them or put them in planters and such.
I'm making them tough it out in Cloverdale, I gotta say.
Yeah.
All right, in the same vein, we have my most difficult landscape problem is selecting natives that are adapted to both full sun as well as hardy to heavy frost damage in North Healdsburg. Any suggestions on plants?
April, you want to lead off?
So say that again.
So
She's trying to find natives that are adapted to both full sun as well as heavy frost.
Heavy frost, yeah. So I would really look at Cowscape for what is native to your zone. We have had so much luck with like California coffeeberry species would be fine. A lot of the shrubs like ribes and trying to think of grasses would be great, like deer grass up in that zone. Salvias, like Salvia clevelandii can tolerate that range, although they're short-lived, but they give you a ton of life in that space. Salvia sonamensis, a ground cover, just shooting in the dark. Mimi?
Yeah, I've not really experienced a lot of problems with frost damage on my natives.
California
Rhamnus,
fuchsia, epilobia.
yeah, California fuchsia. So any of the like perennial or grass
Mhm.
ones, I mean,
Mhm.
you're going to be cutting them back
Mhm.
in late winter anyway. So your perennials and grasses are really not too much of an issue, I find. Rhamnus for me, which coffeeberry, which I absolutely adore,
Mhm.
just way too hot in the full sun in Cloverdale. Just
Right, yeah, you need it in the part shade.
No
Yeah.
But Arctostaphylos and Ceanothus are I've never really had any problems with in the Cloverdale area. We are a little bit up on a slope, so we don't get as hard frost. So, I'd be so curious, Galen, if you could add in the chat or your comments, if there's any specific examples of what you've had that have had some heavy frost damage. And I don't know, John, have you had any experience with heavy frost damage on some natives?
No, I haven't lost natives that I have to frost or freeze. And so that would include some things like yarrows, milkweed. I have a lot of the buckwheats and the California fuchsia that April mentioned, Epilobium canum, a number of varieties of manzanitas, for some grasses, deer grass, a couple of species of Calamagrostis, reed grasses. I love purple needlegrass, and that's in full sun for me, and I don't think there'd be any hardiness problem with that. They'll spread around.
Foothill penstemon should do well up there. Yeah. Oftentimes it's just like giving it some time, like not thinking it's dead, just giving a plant a little time. Like if they have a hard frost, give it a little extra water and don't give up. I have a lot of clients that are like, that's dead. I'm like, no, that's not dead. It's just give it a little time to come back.
I love it. They've been all plant questions tonight, you guys.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And we have another one. I found Ceanothus and Fremontodendron to be both short-lived. Any suggestions to encourage them to live longer?
Don't look at them and don't give them any attention. Fremontodendron especially, like I love Fremontodendron, but it really wants like well-drained soils, not a lot of irrigation, especially drip irrigation is not going to make it happy.
And don't ever try to move it.
Don't move it. Just like, you're not pretty, I walk away. But joking aside, both Ceanothus and Fremontodendron are beautiful in your garden. So just like well drained on a hillside behind a wall, like I showed in my pictures. Super. I mean, those photos were super hot sun at Mark West, like near Healdsburg. Have done really well, but less water, less drip.
Yeah, I've seen some native plant authors that have talked about ceanothus, and that the myth of it being short-lived is because people are over irrigating it.
Yeah,
So you
absolutely.
really have to remember that the plants have adapted to our summer dry climate. They don't want typically water in the summer. We do recommend from a fire-wise perspective that you do some periodic, like maybe once or twice a month irrigation soaking to keep it in optimal condition, especially during fire season. But often that short-lived reputation is associated with overwatering.
Okay. Well, that was our last question. So if anyone out there still has something they're wondering about, plants or otherwise.
Jen, I will go ahead and resurrect a question that I answered in writing, but it's a good one, and I'd like to see what other folks have to offer as well. The question was, are there any native plants that can be used to create plant islands over your leach fields? And I responded that over leach fields, you want to avoid trees, you want to avoid shrubs, you want to avoid big, deep-rooted things. So drought-tolerant grasses and perennials are typically recommended. And so I was thinking of some native grasses like Calamagrostis foliosa, which is sometimes called leafy reedgrass, Festuca idahoensis, Idaho fescue, which despite its name also is a native of California. And then for some flowering perennials, California fuchsia, woolly sunflower might be considered. And what other ideas do people have?
That comes up so much in my landscapes because we're in like in unincorporated Sebastopol. California fescue is a great one. Any of the grasses, I know they have like substantial roots, but as long as, like John said, as long as you're keeping with the perennials, it works really well. Penstemon, like foothill penstemon heterophilus. We dot in boulders and things like that, you know, like playing on hardscape in those kind of spaces too.
I do something sort of a native grassland kind of a
Yeah,
look.
perennial meadow. I always like perennial meadow
Perennial
over that. So, and that can be perennial meadow throughout the state is different. Perennial meadow here in Sebastopol, perennial meadow in Napa, perennial meadow up in Healdsburg are different plant sources like Spirabolus. Aeroides, the alkali cication is another wonderful grass that works like more north in the heat and is deciduous in the summer. So just like look at that perennial grassland situation over your leach field should be fine. That's a great question. I hope I'm right, because otherwise in 5 years we're gonna have some problems.
All right. No, oh, wait, did we? Let's see. Nope. No other questions.
It's great to see how many people turned out tonight
and asked plant questions. That was awesome.
We love plant questions.
Usually it doesn't skew in that direction, so it was a nice change.
Yeah, these guys love plant questions.
We love plants.
We don't get to talk about them enough.
I love it. You guys are amazing. You guys are so good at this.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us.
I see some fun
my
clients on this list, Shigeo.
We also have a new maintenance workshop that Jen's leading for us. Watch out for some that we're doing seasonally. Watch out for a summer maintenance workshop and a fall maintenance workshop from us later this year. And thanks all for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Night everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.